What would you do if the woman you bought for $2 at a remote backwoods auction lifted her sack and whispered a name that sent an entire logging town into panic? Before the truth comes out, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to drag you deeper than any mystery you've heard this year. In the forgotten northern stretch of the bitterpine forest, where the pines clawed at the sky like giant fingers and winter storms could swallow entire cabins whole, lived a man known only as Cutter Hale, a solitary, broad-shouldered lumberjack whose voice had rusted from lack of use and whose heart had been worn thin by years of chopping trees and burying memories. He had once loved a woman, or at least the idea of one, but she vanished into the woods 12 years earlier, leaving only a torn scarf and a trail of tracks that ended abruptly by Blackwater Creek. Cutter had learned to harvest silence instead of happiness, speaking more to his axe than to any living soul, until one bleak September evening when his supply mule went lame and he walked into the nearby settlement of Gristmill Ridge, a rough place where lanterns flickered like nervous eyes and where men with cracked hands and dirty boots gathered for moonshine, gossip, and the kind of trade no civilized town would admit to. That night, beneath a sagging canvas tent that smelled of sweat and spilled liquor, a traveling caravan of mountain collectors, as they called themselves, hosted a masked auction where no livestock were shown, only humans, captured from who knows where, bound by rope and silence. Cutter disliked crowds, disliked noise, disliked anything that reminded him of the world beyond trees, but something tugged at him as he passed the tent, a strange magnetic pull that felt like memory tapping his spine. Inside, he saw 6 figures kneeling on the dirt floor, each with a burlap sack over their head. The auctioneer, a greasy man with a silver tooth that glinted every time he said a number, barked out prices while the crowd made crude jokes, but Cutter watched without speaking until the 5th figure was revealed. A woman smaller than the rest, her shoulders trembling, her sack stained as if she'd been dragged through mud. $2 to start, the auctioneer said, laughing because no one would pay even that for a scrawny, silent woman with no known origin, and the crowd jeered, tossing bets about who she'd bite first. But Cutter's chest tightened. There was something about the way her fingers curled inward, like she was trying to erase herself. Before he understood why, before his brain caught up to the instinct screaming inside him, Cutter raised a calloused hand, and the tent fell silent because Cutter Hale never spoke, never bid, never involved himself in anyone's business. $2, he said, the first word he'd spoken in 3 months, and the auctioneer blinked in disbelief but slammed his gavel anyway, shouting, "Sold." As if relieved someone had taken the problem off his hands. Cutter lifted the woman effortlessly and carried her away from the catcalls, ignoring people's mutters that he was cursed, insane, or both. He walked her through pine shadows back to his cabin, the air chilled with early frost, and once inside, he cut her ropes carefully, slid the burlap up and off her head, and froze. Her face was dirt-streaked but startlingly beautiful beneath the grime, her eyes wide with fear and something else, a kind of recognition. She tried to speak, voice cracking like thin ice, but he gently pressed a tin cup of warm water to her lips. When she finally found her words, her voice wavered yet carried a strange familiarity. "My name is Lyra." Cutter felt the name like a hammer to the chest because Lyra was the name of the woman he had loved 12 years ago, the woman who disappeared without explanation, but this woman was far too young to be her, barely in her mid-20s, while his Lyra would be pushing 40, but the resemblance in the eyes, the slope of the cheek, the shape of the mouth was uncanny enough to make his pulse thunder. She looked at him with trembling certainty and whispered, "Cutter Hale, you were supposed to find me." He staggered back, demanding how she knew his name, but before she answered, a wolf-like howl echoed from the forest, 3 sharp notes followed by one long, mournful wail. Cutter recognized the signal. It meant someone, or something, was tracking her. Lyra flinched violently, begging him to douse the lantern, whispering that the people who sold her weren't the ones who captured her, that the real hunters were still out there, watching. Cutter didn't know what frightened him more, the possibility of danger lurking outside or the impossible familiarity of the woman standing in his cabin claiming a name tied to a missing ghost from his past. As the lantern glow faded and darkness swallowed the room, she whispered one more thing, so quietly it nearly drowned beneath the wind rattling the shutters. "Cutter, I know what happened to the real Lyra." The cabin floor seemed to tilt beneath his boots as cold dread wrapped around his spine and he realized the night wasn't going to end quietly, and the woman he'd bought for $2 might be the key to a secret buried far deeper than the roots of any pine he'd ever cut. The moment Lyra's final whispered words drifted into the darkness of the cabin, Cutter felt the familiar world he'd carved out for himself, one built of wood, silence, and routine, begin to splinter, for he had spent 12 long years trying to bury the memories of the real Lyra beneath sawdust and loneliness, and now this ghost-eyed woman stood before him claiming to know the truth he had both longed for and feared. The wind roared outside as though the forest itself were warning him, rattling the shutters and sending a thin layer of frost across the windowpane, but Cutter couldn't tear his eyes from the woman whose face looked like an echo of someone he had once loved so fiercely it had nearly destroyed him. Lyra, this new Lyra, wrapped her arms around herself and stepped toward the cabin wall as though certain something outside was listening, and when Cutter demanded she explain what she meant, she spoke quickly, urgently, her words tumbling like stones down a cliff. She told him she hadn't been kidnapped for sale, but for silence, that she had fled a hidden settlement deep within Bitterpine known as Timberfall Hollow, a place Cutter had heard rumors of but never believed existed, an underground community tied to old logging families who were rumored to guard ancient secrets of the forest, secrets about disappearances, midnight rituals, and a history buried so deep beneath the roots of the pines that outsiders wrote them off as drunken folktales. She told him that the real Lyra, the woman Cutter once loved, had stumbled upon that community years ago, had been taken by them, and that before the real Lyra died, yes, died, Lyra repeated through trembling lips, she made the Timberfall elders swear to protect someone, a child, a young girl who shared her blood and her name, a girl who vanished from the settlement at the age of 10 and had been hunted ever since. Cutter's breath caught in his throat as the truth hit him. The woman in front of him wasn't the adult Lyra from his past but the child he never knew existed, the daughter of the woman he'd loved, a daughter who shared her mother's name and features, a daughter who had somehow survived 12 years of hiding and running, but before he could speak, a heavy thud shook the cabin door, and Cutter grabbed his axe, shoulders braced with instinct he hadn't relied on since the old days when he'd tracked wild predators through the snow. A second strike clapped against the wood, then a low growl seeped through the cracks, a voice, human but distorted as though muffled by something thick. "Bring her out," it hissed. "You don't know what she is." Lyra shrank behind Cutter, insisting that the men outside weren't men at all, that Timberfall Hollow's enforcers had been altered over generations by some forest-born toxin that made them stronger, faster, and part mad, and Cutter, though he had no reason to believe such a thing, felt his skin prickle as a shadow passed the window, tall enough to reach the eaves. He grabbed Lyra's wrist and pulled her into the back room, lifting a hidden floor panel he hadn't touched in over a decade, an escape tunnel he carved back when he believed the real Lyra would return and they'd need a way to flee from imagined dangers. Never had he thought he'd use it with her daughter. They slid into the cold, dirt-lined passage just as the cabin door burst inward, the sound of splintering wood echoing behind them. Cutter crawled forward with Lyra at his heels, the tunnel sloping downward beneath the forest, and when they emerged in a rocky outcrop beside a frozen creek, the night felt charged with electricity. Lyra clutched Cutter's arm and pointed upstream toward a faint amber glow flickering between the trees. "Signal fires," she whispered, "Timberfall scouts marking territory." Cutter pulled her into the deeper woods, the scent of pine thick around them, and demanded the truth once more. Why had her mother hidden her? Why was Timberfall hunting her? And what did the elders vow to preserve? Lyra hesitated before revealing that the real Lyra had discovered something buried beneath the forest floor, an artifact or a vault or perhaps a body, she wasn't sure, which contained evidence that Timberfall Hollow's leaders had been manipulating the region's logging operations for decades, using strange, hallucinogenic spores found only in bitterpine bark to control workers, shape memories, and erase dissent. The real Lyra had been a mapper then, studying the forest for environmental protections, and she had seen too much. Cutter felt a surge of grief and fury collide within him, a hurricane of emotions he'd spent years avoiding. He demanded to know whether she had proof of her claims, but Lyra shook her head and said that when her mother died, she passed one thing down to her, a warning that Cutter Hale was the only man she could trust and that someday Lyra would find him. They hadn't gone far when the distant howl echoed again, closer now, and Lyra gasped that Timberfall's trackers traveled in threes, one to flush, one to follow, one to kill. Cutter took her hand and pulled her toward a ridge that only seasoned loggers knew how to climb, scaling its jagged face until they reached a plateau that overlooked the entire forest valley. From there, they saw movement, torches weaving through the pines, dozens, maybe more, and Cutter realized this wasn't a pursuit, it was a sweep, a clearing. Timberfall Hollow wasn't trying to retrieve Lyra. They were trying to erase her. He turned to Lyra and swore they would make it to the old ranger station on the west side, a place built of stone where the trackers couldn't burn them out. As they descended the far side of the ridge, Cutter heard branches cracking behind them, fast, too fast for any normal man, and he shoved Lyra forward just as a hulking figure lunged from the trees, its eyes reflecting a sickly yellow light, its movements unnervingly fluid. Cutter swung his axe, catching the creature across its shoulder, but it barely flinched, instead speaking in a raspy voice, "She belongs to the Hollow." Cutter roared back that she belonged to nobody, and he hacked again, this time striking bone. The figure stumbled, but two more shadows emerged, rushing toward them. Lyra screamed for Cutter to run, insisting that she would only slow him down, but Cutter lifted her completely off the ground, throwing her over his shoulder as he sprinted toward the ravine ahead. The ground trembled as the creatures closed in. With one final desperate leap, Cutter hurled himself and Lyra over the edge, landing painfully on the snow-covered slope that carried them sliding down in a whirlwind of white and darkness until they crashed near the frozen riverbank. Cutter's ribs ached and Lyra's forehead was bleeding, but they were alive, for now. In the darkness, Cutter could see faint tracks leading toward the west, evidence of an old snowmobile trail that hadn't been used in years. He helped Lyra stand, his breath steaming in the cold, and whispered one final question before they continued their escape, one that had been gnawing at him since she spoke her name. Lyra, what exactly did your mother find beneath this forest? Lyra wiped the blood from her brow, her eyes reflecting the moonlight, and said with trembling certainty, something the hollow will kill every last soul in Bitterpine to keep buried. The frozen river groaned beneath the growing weight of winter as Cutter and Lyra staggered across it, breath labored, fear sharpening every step, for the forest behind them pulsed with the sound of the hollow's trackers closing in, a haunting rhythm of snapping branches, low snarls, and the occasional sickening thump of something heavy hitting the snow. Cutter held Lyra close, keeping her upright when she wavered, his body aching from the fall, yet driven by a fire he hadn't felt in years, a desperate need to protect this girl who carried the last heartbeat of the woman he once loved. The sky stretched above them like a torn sheet of iron, and when a streak of lightning cracked across the horizon, Lyra whispered that the storm wasn't natural. Timberfall Hollow had long learned to use the forest's strange spores to manipulate weather patterns, bending the storm systems that drifted over Bitterpine to trap or flush out prey, and Cutter felt a chill not from the cold but from the realization that the Hollow's power was deeper, darker, and far more calculated than mere folklore. They reached the far bank, stumbling into a thicket of frost-coated firs, and Cutter guided Lyra up a narrow incline toward the abandoned ranger station, a crumbling stone outpost perched atop a granite rise overlooking half the valley. But before they reached it, Lyra collapsed to her knees, coughing violently as black specks flecked her lips. Cutter panicked, thinking she was injured, but Lyra shook her head weakly and explained that she'd been exposed to the forest spores as a child, that the hollow had fed them into the air of their underground chambers to control the young, and though she had escaped, some residue had stayed inside her lungs for years, dormant until the trackers stirred the fungi from the pines. Cutter lifted her in his arms like she weighed nothing and pressed onward, every breath a stab of cold, until the ranger station rose before them, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, but its stone walls still strong enough to hold back anything short of fire or dynamite. As Cutter forced the rusted door open, Lyra whispered something he almost didn't hear. My mother didn't just find evidence, she found someone alive. Cutter froze, setting her gently against the wall as he demanded she explain, and Lyra, her body trembling, her breath hitching with fear and urgency, told him the full story her mother had once whispered to her before the hollow discovered they had been speaking in secret. Years ago, while mapping mineral content along the deeper ridgelines, the real Lyra had stumbled into a series of underground caverns beneath Bitterpine, a place untouched by sunlight, where strange bioluminescent fungi clung to the stone like shivering stars, and in the center of that cavern she found a man, chained, alive but barely conscious, a man who had been missing for 20 years, a logging inspector sent by the state to investigate illegal deforestation. But he wasn't simply captive, he was altered, infected by the spores until he lived in a half-dreaming state, muttering secrets about memory manipulation, environmental sabotage, and entire towns being steered like cattle. Before Cutter could fully process the horror of it, Lyra added that the man had spoken a familiar name, gasping it again and again as her mother tried to free him. Hale. Cutter felt his blood go cold as Lyra explained that the inspector, the prisoner, had claimed Cutter's own father had once discovered the Hollow's secrets decades earlier and tried to expose them, only to vanish without a trace. The Hollow had not only silenced him, they had built decades of operations around the legacy of men who tried to cross them. The revelation shook Cutter like an earthquake, memories of his father, strong, stubborn, honest, crashing through him like a river breaking a dam, and he realized that his life had been shaped by the Hollow long before he ever knew they existed. As he processed this, a thunderous crash shook the ranger station, and Cutter spun just in time to see the trackers scaling the outer wall like monstrous silhouettes, 3 of them, their limbs too long, their breaths visible as pale mist. Cutter shoved a fallen cabinet against the door, then dragged Lyra toward the back where an old map cabinet leaned half-rotten against the stones. Lyra gasped that the underground caverns her mother found were connected to the ranger station through a forgotten drainage shaft, sealed decades ago when the government tried to bury evidence of the inspector's disappearance. Cutter tore the cabinet aside, kicked open the rusted grate beneath it, and dropped into the darkness below with Lyra clinging to him as the ceiling above them shook from the tracker's impact. They slid down a steep tunnel of mud and stone until they crashed into a cavern glowing faintly blue with fungal light, and for a moment, both simply lay there, staring at the impossible beauty around them, stalactites shimmering like living crystals, spore clouds drifting like silent snowfall, and the remnants of old chains drilled into the walls. Lyra whispered that this was the place, the chamber where her mother had found the inspector, and Cutter, swallowing the rising fear, asked where the man was now. Lyra's eyes filled with tears as she replied that the Hollow had dragged him deeper into the tunnels before her mother could free him, and that her mother had died trying to stop them. Cutter clenched his fists, the weight of grief and rage building into something volcanic, something that burned away the last traces of the quiet, solitary life he once lived. The cavern trembled as the trackers dropped through the tunnel behind them, snarling, and Cutter grabbed Lyra's hand, sprinting into the maze of tunnels lit only by the faint glow of spores. They ran through darkness, through echoes of something large moving in the depths, until they reached a massive stone gate carved with symbols older than the settlement itself, markings Lyra recognized from her mother's journal. She pressed her palm to the stone, whispered the phrase her mother taught her, "The forest remembers," and the gate rumbled open, revealing a second chamber where a man lay slumped against the wall, alive but barely. Cutter knew instantly who he was. The inspector, the one his father had tried to save, the root of the Hollow's secrets. The man's eyes fluttered open, sickly and luminous from spore exposure, and when he saw Cutter, he gasped, "You look just like him." Before Cutter could speak, the trackers burst into the chamber, and everything erupted into chaos. Cutter fought like a man possessed, swinging his axe into mutated bone and fungal flesh, Lyra pulling the weakened inspector toward the far exit, and just when it seemed they would be overwhelmed, the cavern shook with a booming crack, an ancient support beam buckled, the ceiling collapsing from years of spore rot. Cutter grabbed Lyra and the inspector, dragging them through the narrow exit moments before the entire chamber caved in, burying the trackers forever. They emerged into the open forest just as dawn broke over Bitterpine, golden light spilling through the trees. The inspector, now free, vowed to expose everything, every crime, every manipulation, every disappearance the Hollow orchestrated. Lyra, finally safe, looked at Cutter with an emotion deeper than gratitude, something like destiny circling back on itself. And Cutter, a man who once lived only for silence, found himself standing beside the daughter of the woman he once loved. And a man his own father died trying to protect. As they made their way out of the forest toward the world that would soon learn the truth about Timberfall Hollow, Lyra slipped her hand into Cutter's and whispered, "My mother was right. You were the only one she trusted." And for the first time in 12 years, Cutter Hale let himself believe that love, broken, buried, and resurrected, could still find him in the deepest shadows of the pines.